We're going to be delving into pivot tables in this video. Now, pivot tables are incredibly powerful for summarising data and an absolute essential for analysts to have in their toolkit. Now, like anything we're learning in this video series, the key is to keep practicing yourself so it becomes really normal to use these tools. They are unbelievably powerful, and it's likely that you'll need them on a regular basis as an Excel user. So for this video, you can download the dataset we'll be using during the tutorial from my website, which I'll put in the link below, and you can find it in the free datasets course. So we'll be using Pupils Dataset C. And of course, you can watch previous videos in this series first by clicking on the playlist that, again, I'll put in the description. And that's going to give you that background about the dataset that we're working with. We've already prepared our data for analysis, so the dataset is in the form of a table. However, I'm going to show you the difference between a pivot table that uses a table and one that uses data that isn't in a table. The simplest way to start a pivot table is to click anywhere in the dataset and then go up to the Insert tab. From here, we're going to click on Pivot Table, and it gives you a pop-up box like this. Because we've already clicked into the table, it's referencing the name of the table, which is great. And then we're going to click on OK. So it's put the pivot table in a new worksheet, and it's named it Sheet 1. So in the worksheet itself, we get the pivot table, and if we click into the pivot table, then you can see at the side we've got a list of the fields in the pivot table fields list, and this is simply a list of the fields we have from our dataset. So ID, gender, all the percentages for all the different scores. As I've mentioned, pivot tables are all about summarising data, so let's look at how that works now. In the values section down here, it will contain values, funnily enough. So these are things like the quantities, sums, a max or a min of a value. So let's have a look at that first. Now, I know from our data set that we have 30 pupils in this list. So I want to get a count of that in this pivot table. So I am going to bring in the ID field and drop it into the values. Now, if the field is numerical, like ID is, it automatically puts it into a sum, but we want to count the field. So we're going to go to the field in the value section, left click on it here, and then go to value field settings. And there's all sorts of different options here, but we're going to choose the count, and I can rename it up here. So I'm going to change it to quantity and then click on OK. As we can see in the pivot table, it is now showing 30, which is great. And the actual pivot table looks like it's got a lot smaller. So it really only shows the sort of information that it needs that you've got in the pivot table. It won't take up excessive amounts of space. Now, by using some known information that I understood that we had 30 pupils in the list, it's actually validated what we are seeing here. And again, this is an important part of being an analyst, validating the data and being sure that what you're seeing is what you're expecting to come through. The next thing we're going to do is to place fields in the rows and the columns section to see what happens. So let's start with using gender, and the pivot will now put them into a group. So we can see that there are 18 female students and 12 male students, which amounts to our 30 pupils altogether. So using the columns, we'll do exactly the same. If we move that across, it just presents it in a different way. So I'll look at gender back in rows because I think that sets it out in quite a nice way. And then I'm going to look at the last part of this pivot table, which is the filters. So we can drag any field in here, but just be aware that if you want a field that's in the columns or rows section, it will drop out of those sections. If I bring gender into here, it takes it out of the rows. But again, similar to how you would filter in a normal data set, you can just click on this arrow and we can select multiple items if you've got a long list. Or if you just wanted to bring through one of the values, female or male, then you can do that. So let's put that back. And it might be that you just want to keep that information there so that a user can come and filter that as they need to. The other great and very powerful thing about pivots is that you can double click on the data within it. So if I wanted to, let's say, bring the gender back in, and I want to double click on the male students here, it will then bring back this list of just the male students. I can then delete that data set, so it's created it on a new sheet, so I'm just going to delete that now. And then it still has my pivot table. I could double click on it again and it would generate that list again. I now want to show you what happens when you create a pivot table from a data set that isn't a table. So we're going to go to the additional table tab, and we're actually going to convert this back to not be a table anymore. So to do that, we need to right click on it, and we're going to go down to table and then convert to range. So this will be a normal range. So although it's kept the formatting, this is no longer a table. So we've just got our pupils table, and now this isn't a table anymore. So I'm going to go and insert a pivot table. Now you can see that the table or range is now the tab for additional information, but it references from cell A1 to cell C31. And if I click in here, we can have a little look and make sure that we're happy that this is the right range. So yeah, it was A1 to C31, that's fine. And then we're going to put it on a new worksheet and click on OK. So let's see and make sure that we get the same results in terms of the number of pupils. So I understand that the data should have those 30 pupils in again. So we'll put that in the values, and then we will go to value field settings and we will count it again. And I will rename it as quantity. I'm going to go back to the data set and add an additional row to both of the data sets for pupil 31, and I don't have any other information, so I can just add this field in, this column to the pupil ID, and then I'm going to go to pupils and do exactly the same at the end, add in pupil 31. Now let's go to our pivot table. So our first one was on sheet 1, and I'm going to right click on it and refresh it. And that has got our new pupil that doesn't have a gender, so it comes across as blank, and that's come from our pupils dataset, which is the one coming from a table. We're then going to go to sheet 3, which is the pivot table that comes off additional information, which is not a table, and I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to refresh, and this one hasn't updated with the extra pupil in it. So let's check out what's going on with the data source. So we want to click on the pivot like this, and then we're going to go to the Analyze tab and change data source, then change data source again. And as you can see, if I scroll down, it's picking up the values that we specified before, which was up to cell C31, and it's not including this additional row. So I can change it here and do C32 and click on OK, and now it comes through in the dataset. So I hope you can see that you can do pivot tables in two different ways. Both are very viable, but the first option, creating a pivot table from a table itself, is a better and more sustainable option that will ensure that you don't miss extra data that might get added in later. So now it's your turn to download the dataset, create a pivot table from both of the datasets, add data into the pivot to summarise it, then add an extra row on both of the datasets and refresh the pivots to see your changes coming through. And remember just to change that second dataset, the additional information, back to a normal range so it's not a table anymore. And when you've done all of this, you can click on like or put done in the comments below.